Britain has just crossed a line that many believed would never be tested. In a stunning legal intervention, the Supreme Court has stepped in and struck down what is now being described as Keir Starmer's secret EU plan. This is not just another political setback. This is a moment that has shaken Westminster to its core. A moment that has left voters asking whether the will of the people was quietly being ignored behind closed doors. And tonight, the consequences are only just beginning to unfold. The shockwave hit Westminster the moment the ruling was made public. What had been whispered for weeks as political rumour suddenly became undeniable legal fact. The Supreme Court ruled that actions taken by the government crossed a constitutional boundary, making it clear that any serious attempt to reshape Britain's post-Brexit relationship with the European Union cannot happen without full transparency and parliamentary authority. This decision did more than block a process. It exposed one. At the centre of the storm stands Keir Starmer, a Prime Minister who built his reputation on respect for law, procedure and democratic norms. That is what makes this moment so explosive. Critics say the issue is not Europe itself, but secrecy. Allegations that discussions were taking place without clear public consent have struck a nerve in a country still deeply divided over Brexit. For many voters, this feels less like policy debate and more like betrayal. Inside Number 10, the atmosphere reportedly turned tense within minutes of the ruling. Emergency meetings were called, senior advisors scrambled to assess the damage. Legal teams were brought in as officials realised the seriousness of a Supreme Court rebuke. This was not a symbolic judgment. It was a hard stop, and everyone involved understood the weight of that message. Public reaction was immediate and emotional. Social media erupted with anger and disbelief. Many people who are not normally engaged in politics expressed frustration that something so significant could have been discussed quietly. Brexit, for millions, was meant to settle a question of sovereignty. The idea that it could be adjusted without open debate reopened wounds that never fully healed. Opposition parties seized the moment, framing the ruling as proof that trust had been broken. Even some supporters of the government struggled to defend what they could not clearly explain. As the day progressed, one truth became unavoidable. This was no longer just a legal issue. It had become a defining test of credibility, leadership and respect for democratic limits. And Britain was watching closely. As the ruling echoed across the country, the political fallout intensified at breathtaking speed. What made this moment so dangerous was not just the court's words, but what they implied. Legal experts were clear. This was not a technical disagreement or a narrow procedural issue. The Supreme Court had effectively drawn a red line and warned that democratic authority cannot be bypassed. No matter how quietly it is done, that message landed hard inside Parliament. MPs from across the political spectrum reacted with visible alarm. Many admitted privately that they had not been fully briefed on the depth or direction of EU-related discussions taking place behind the scenes. For lawmakers representing Brexit-supporting constituencies, this revelation was explosive. Constituents were already demanding answers, and MPs suddenly found themselves exposed, unable to explain decisions they never knowingly approved. Behind closed doors, frustration turned into suspicion. Cabinet members reportedly demanded urgent clarification, asking who authorised the talks, how far they had progressed, and why transparency was avoided. In politics, once secrecy enters the picture, trust begins to fracture. Allies start questioning motives. Colleagues start protecting themselves. Unity becomes fragile almost overnight. Outside Westminster, the public mood shifted from shock to anger. Protest groups and campaign organisations framed the ruling as proof that constant vigilance is necessary to protect democratic decisions. Even voters who support closer EU ties questioned why secrecy was ever necessary. Many said the issue was not Europe, but honesty. If the public had been confident in the process, the reaction would have been very different. Media coverage grew relentless. Headlines spoke of betrayal, backroom deals, and a leadership disconnected from voters. News panels debated whether this was a misjudgment or something more deliberate. Every explanation offered by government sources was picked apart, analysed, and challenged. Silence from the top only made matters worse. International observers also took notice. Allies watched carefully as Britain appeared once again locked in internal conflict over its future direction. Markets reacted cautiously, reflecting growing concern that political instability could spill into economic uncertainty. What was intended to remain quiet diplomacy had instead triggered a national reckoning. By the end of the day, one reality was impossible to ignore. The Supreme Court had not simply blocked a path, it had forced the country to confront a deeper truth. Brexit was never fully settled. It remained a fault line, and that fault line had just been shaken at the highest legal level, with consequences that were only beginning to surface. As pressure mounted, attention turned directly toward Keir Starmer himself. For a leader who built his public image around law, fairness and institutional respect, the symbolism of a Supreme Court intervention was devastating. Commentators across the media repeated the same uncomfortable point. If constitutional boundaries matter to anyone, they should matter here. That contradiction quickly became central to the story. Inside Labour, the atmosphere reportedly shifted from concern to quiet alarm. Senior figures understood that this crisis was no longer about policy detail or legal nuance. It was about perception. And perception moves faster than truth. Once the phrase secret EU plan takes hold in the public imagination, it becomes almost impossible to contain. Even loyal supporters struggled to explain what exactly had been happening, and uncertainty fed doubt. Public frustration continued to grow as the hours passed. Radio phone-ins and online forums filled with ordinary voters saying they felt excluded from decisions that shaped their future. Many stressed they were not demanding a specific outcome, only honesty. That message cut across party lines, making the situation far more dangerous than a typical political scandal. When anger is bipartisan, damage accelerates. The government's delayed response only deepened the problem. Each hour without a clear, direct explanation created space for speculation. Political opponents filled that space quickly, repeating the same accusations with increasing confidence. Supporters, lacking clear facts, fell silent. In politics, silence is rarely neutral. It is often interpreted as admission. Media coverage intensified with every development. Headlines framed the ruling as a turning point. Analysts debated whether this was a temporary storm or the beginning of a deeper collapse in trust. Legal experts explained the judgment in detail, while political commentators focused on what it revealed about leadership culture inside government. The story was no longer fading, it was growing. By evening, the narrative had shifted again. This was no longer only about Europe or Brexit. It had become a broader argument about power, transparency and accountability. The Supreme Court had effectively forced a pause, but it had also forced a mirror in front of the government. And what many people saw reflected back made them deeply uncomfortable. As night closed in on Westminster, the full weight of the crisis became impossible to ignore. This was no longer a fast-moving news cycle that could be waited out. It had hardened into something deeper, something far more dangerous for any government. Trust had been shaken, and once trust is damaged, it rarely repairs itself quickly. Insiders describe a leadership under siege, not from rivals alone, but from doubts spreading inside its own ranks. Senior figures warned privately that the longer uncertainty continued, the worse the consequences would become. Every unanswered question fueled suspicion. Every delayed explanation strengthened the belief that something was being hidden. For many voters, this was not about legal detail or diplomatic nuance. It was about a simple fear that decisions affecting the nation were being shaped without their knowledge or consent. Backbench MPs reportedly grew increasingly nervous. In marginal constituencies, the mood on the ground was changing rapidly. Voters were no longer asking about future plans or promises. They were asking whether their voices still mattered at all. Those are the questions politicians fear most because they strike at legitimacy rather than popularity. And legitimacy, once questioned, is extremely difficult to restore. Opposition parties moved quickly to lock in the narrative. They framed the Supreme Court ruling as proof that guardrails exist for a reason, and that those guardrails had been tested. They did not need exaggeration. The court's intervention spoke for itself. Each repetition of the story reinforced the idea that leadership had overreached and that consequence had finally followed. Meanwhile, international attention intensified. Allies watched Britain with growing concern, questioning whether political instability would weaken its influence abroad. Economic analysts warned that prolonged uncertainty could damage confidence and investment. The ripple effects of a domestic legal ruling were now spreading beyond borders, touching markets, diplomacy and global perception. Inside government, a hard truth began to settle. This moment could not be undone. No statement, no clarification, no carefully worded speech could erase the fact that the Supreme Court had intervened. The only remaining question was what came next. Would leadership confront the issue openly or retreat into silence and strategy? Britain now stands at a crossroads defined not by policy, but by trust. The ruling has forced a pause, but it has also forced reflection. People are watching closely, not with excitement, but with caution. Because when belief in leadership weakens, the ground beneath power begins to shift. And once that shift starts, standing still is often the most dangerous move of all. Now, the country waits, and waiting may be the most dangerous phase of all. Political storms do not always end with dramatic collapses. Sometimes they drain authority slowly, quietly, while leaders remain in place but lose something far more important than office: confidence. That is the risk facing Keir Starmer now. Not an immediate fall, but a long erosion that weakens every decision he makes from this point forward. For many voters, this episode has confirmed a growing unease that has been building for years. There's a feeling that politics happens above their heads, that major choices are discussed in rooms they will never enter and explained only after pressure forces the truth into the open. Even those who are tired of Brexit debates feel pulled back in, not because they want to relive the past, but because they fear history repeating itself. Inside Labour, conversations are shifting in tone. Public loyalty remains, but private doubt is becoming harder to ignore. Strategists know that future elections are not won on legal arguments alone, they are won on trust. And trust, once damaged, demands more than time. It demands proof. Proof that lessons have been learned and lines will not be crossed again. Opponents will not let this moment fade. It will be referenced again and again, used as evidence that transparency had to be enforced rather than offered. Every future discussion about Europe, trade or sovereignty will now carry the shadow of this ruling. The Supreme Court decision has become a warning etched into political memory. Britain moves forward tonight more cautious than before. The shock will pass. The headlines will change. But the doubt will linger. And in politics, doubt is the slowest poison of all. It does not explode. It spreads. What happens next will decide whether this moment becomes a lesson learned, or the point many look back on and say that was when belief finally began to slip away. As the dust slowly begins to settle, one truth becomes increasingly clear. This moment has changed the political atmosphere in Britain in a way that cannot simply be managed away. Even if explanations are offered, even if reassurances are made, the sense of suspicion will not disappear overnight. People are listening more carefully now, they are questioning more deeply, and they are far less willing to accept vague promises or carefully polished words. For Keir Starmer, the challenge ahead is severe. Leadership in times like these is not about surviving the next headline, it is about confronting public doubt directly and honestly. Any attempt to downplay the significance of the Supreme Court's intervention risks reinforcing the belief that transparency only appears when leaders are forced into it. The public mood has shifted, and it is unforgiving. This episode has also sent a wider warning through Westminster. It reminds every party, every minister, and every future government that Brexit remains a live issue, not because of policy alone, but because of trust. Voters may disagree on outcomes, but they are united on one expectation. They want to be included. They want decisions of national importance to be debated openly, not discovered after the fact. The coming weeks will be decisive. Will this crisis lead to a reset marked by openness and accountability? Or will it harden into a permanent scar, shaping how this leadership is viewed for years to come? History suggests that governments rarely collapse in a single moment. They weaken gradually as confidence drains away and belief turns into doubt. Britain is watching closely now, not with excitement, but with caution. The Supreme Court has drawn its line, the public has reacted, and the balance of trust is hanging in the air. What happens next will not be decided in private meetings or legal chambers, but in the court of public opinion, and that is the one court where no leader can afford to lose.